This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. And if you could, please do me a favor and take a moment and leave a rating and review in whatever podcast player you're listening to this on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, doesn't matter. I would greatly appreciate it. And that feedback really helps get other listeners to the show. Also, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you feel so inclined, you can go to geekleader.com/tip and donate to the show. Thanks so much. All right, leaders. Today I'm honored to have Andrew Blotky on the show. He's a executive coach. He's the founder of Azure Leadership Group and the author of a book called Honestly Speaking. So today we're going to talk about leadership. We're going to talk about communication and all the things in between. Anyway, with all that being said, Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be with you.
If you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about your background, how you got into coaching and leadership in general, and why this is important to you.
Yeah, I think the way I came at this is that I really have just held a bunch of different types of communications jobs. And in most of those jobs, I have sort of had to support senior leaders, whether it be politicians that I worked for or, CEOs and senior leaders in companies. And along the way, started managing and leading my own teams too. So I sort of have had to sort of both learn how to support leaders and help them get better at their jobs, but also be a better leader myself, and really have learned, especially along the way, just how important it is to really make sure that you lead and inspire teams to be able to do their best work. So it's sort of become something of a passion of mine, partly because I've seen how powerful it can be when it's really good. And I also know that when it's not good, it can be actually quite painful or detrimental for a bunch of different reasons. But I really came at it because, communication just is something that sort of came pretty naturally to me. And really, I do believe that good communication skills is like a core competency for any leader, whether you're running a team or an organization, or even if you're an individual contributor. If you see yourself as somebody who's a leader, you got to be able to communicate well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen people, lose jobs and worse because of poor communication. Um, and it's one of those things that we're not taught a lot through school, like how to be good communicators. It's one of those things we kind of fall into one way or the other, either through trial and error, or we have a boss that is a very good communicator and we learn from them. Or if you're like me, you have a boss that was a terrible communicator and you kind of learn what not to do in that realm. But for me, I know one of the things that I struggle with is knowing where the boundaries are between transparency of communication and where to kind of because sometimes as leaders, you can't share everything. You have certain things that, confidentiality doesn't allow you to share, but you need to be able to share enough for people to make good decisions and to do their job. How do you coach people and help people that are, bumping up against that, what is too much to share and what is not enough to share when it comes to transparency?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I feel like it's really sort of very specific both to the individual and also to the system that you're operating in. So one individual may have to communicate differently or with different degrees of transparency, depending on the role that they're in, or even the company or the organization that they're in. In general, I would start with an idea, though, that the more transparent you can be, the more open you can be, the better, because that is one of the key things that builds trust and credibility. And over time, that's something that really we know is a core foundation of really effective leadership. Sort of a relational exercise. It's about a relationship. And so even if in one particular moment you can't get it exactly right, or you can't say everything that you need to say, you can still say things like, here's the process that we will use to get to this outcome. I can't talk about the specifics of this individual employment issue, for example, but here's the process that we use to get to that outcome. Or I can't tell you what the exact outcome will be yet. We don't know yet. That's very transparent to say, I don't know. But you can say, here's the criteria that we will use to assess whether, for example, we're going to speak out on a social issue or whether or not we're going to talk about certain things. So part of this is finding ways that you can be transparent and be honest about what you know, what you don't know, and then being transparent about saying, hey, we're not going to be able to talk about this. Here's why. Here's what we can tell you. And here's what I'm going to promise you. We will come back to you and update you regularly. Or here's the process that we use. But why this is so important is because we also now live in a time when all of us have devices in our hands and in our pockets that give us a lot more access to a lot more information that we can also sense check against what we might be hearing from leaders. And so it just anytime a leader isn't transparent or sort of is that in that sort of bunker mentality, people are going to be able to tell whether you're bullshitting them or they're going to be able to tell whether you're like hiding information because they're probably going to be able to go get it somewhere else. So it's like a moment that's actually quite hard for leaders right now to
Mhm.
sort of adjust being more open and transparent. So again, for me, when I coach leaders, sort of like, how can you be as honest as you can? Honest doesn't always mean you share everything, but it means here's what I'm working on, here's what I'm worried about, what I'm struggling with. And again, here's how we decide, here's what we're going to decide, and here's my sort of commitment to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, especially today where we have ChatGPT in our pocket and people always, you can double check everything you say. Honesty is very important. And like you said, saying, I don't know or we don't know yet is, I think, even more important. And when I was a new manager, I felt like people wouldn't like me if I told them I didn't know. So I tried to always come up with a good answer. And I found myself just shooting myself in the foot over and over again. And then I learned that over time that just being honest and saying, I don't know, we'll figure it out together, or I'll get back to you as soon as I can, or I'm not sure. That's a great question. Let me go and figure that out for you and come back to you. And having that, vulnerability to just tell people you don't know and you're going to figure it out is really important because, like you said, it builds trust. Whereas telling somebody I know something and it turns out to be wrong, you just destroyed the trust and it's really hard to get that back.
Yeah, for sure. And I totally agree with you around the vulnerability is what builds trust and it builds credibility over time. And people are far more likely to come along with you on the long term if they feel like you're just being real and honest with them, for sure. It's why I called the book Honestly Speaking. Be honest with yourself, be honest with other people. But also, the other piece of this is it's like, you know, we're going to start from a foundational point of most people are in most jobs because they're competent and they generally will more or less know what they're talking about. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't have gotten hired for the job to begin with. So we have to, as leaders, sort of get over the hump or that idea of that performance. I got to be perfect. I got to know all the answers. I can never say I don't know. I have to have it all buttoned up because that also is a way of eroding trust. That performance or that presentation of perfection and knowing everything perfectly all the time, people know that that's not real and they'll be able to sense it. And so, what we want to do is figure out okay, most of the time, a leader's instinct hopefully will be right. More or less, they probably will know the answers most of the time. But when they don't, let's be honest about it and then work through it together. Because this is also like all of us are trying to, in most situations, like work through things that, like, if it were easy, somebody would have done it already or they would have figured it out already. We're working through things that are difficult and that we want to not just say, I don't know, I'm going to go figure it out, but also invite other people to be a part of the conversation. I want to invite people to come to me with their ideas. It helps them to feel like they're a part of the conversation, part of the solution. And then that breeds a sense of like ownership, like, oh, my manager actually values my opinion. Like, oh, awesome. I feel more motivated. I want to keep being a part of this team or this organization.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I like the way you put it too, is inviting them to come along, like on the journey with you to solve the problem. Because, whenever you do invite somebody and they feel like they're being heard and they're being listened to, then they engage significantly more. But the one time when maybe you ask for their opinion and then you don't comment on it, maybe you don't even read what they wrote, and then you basically damaged all that work that you did of inviting them. So you have to like take the step of inviting them, but also listen and hear them.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think
Sometimes
that's
I'll
an
say,
important step.
sorry. Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes I don't mean to interrupt you. I apologize. Um, Sometimes I think about this in terms of a communication skill, which is you want to root what you're communicating in some form of feedback, based on the feedback that we heard from you or based on that last conversation we had.
Mhm.
So it really helps people to see, oh, Andrew was listening to me. He really did intuit what I said. You could also say, hey, I heard what you said. We analyzed it. Thank you for the idea. We still ended up deciding to do something else, but I really appreciated your bringing the idea to me. Or, hey, I really appreciated that friendly challenge that you provided to what we were doing. It helped us stop to think, is this really what we want to do? And by the way, it made us more sure that we do. And so we've gotten on a better track. So it helps people feel like, oh, if you're going to ask them, it's like we've all been asked to fill out surveys. And then people are like, well, whatever happened to that survey? Like, why should I fill out the next one if they didn't do anything with the first one? So it helps you as a leader build that, that connection, that trust, that relationship. If you sort of root some of it in like, hey, this is the feedback that we heard. Thank you. Here's what we've decided to do with it.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. And I was actually talking to a friend not too long ago who had their company went through like a leadership change, and as part of that, they had an executive send out an email. It wasn't really a survey. It was just like, hey, can you write up some things of processes that we do today and things that you think would be better if we changed them and stuff like that. And this person wrote up this, couple page document of all the processes that they work with and the areas where they see gaps. They made this nice little gap analysis. They sent it off. And then a couple weeks later, they had their one-on-one with that person that asked for that, and it didn't come up. So they waited, till the next one-on-one. And then they finally said, hey, remember that document that you asked? I put that together, just send it. And I said, oh, I forgot you sent that. I didn't even look at it yet. I'll get around to it. And that basically just shut down that relationship, going forward. Now this person feels like, oh, I can't even send them anything because they're not going to read it anyway. It's just a waste of my time. And,
Mm.
and they feel like now that they're not valued just because of that one interaction.
Yeah. And it's like I'm honestly like sympathetic on both sides of this here
Mhm.
too.
Me too.
Also
I've
got
done
that
that too.
and a manager with a lot of people sending me a lot of stuff all the time. And you're like, sometimes I'm definitely not perfect. Things
Mhm.
just slip through the cracks. And so I would like to sort of, again, this is why this stuff is so important about a relationship. Like, if you have a long term trusted relationship, I'm going to be able to give a little bit more grace to like my managers, like, oh, they missed that email. And then you just like friendly, hey, did you see that? I actually don't want to take it too personally. But if you don't have that long term trust or that built credibility, I 1,000% see, especially if you're newer in career, you're still trying to figure out your relationship with your manager, whoever, it's really hard. So I think it definitely goes both ways, but it's why we want to make sure that we sort of treat this as like, oh, we're in a long-term relationship. Every interaction will either make the relationship better or make it worse, right? So,
Yeah, and I think when you say like long-term relationship and you give more grace if they've had like a history of doing things right and then they mess up once or twice, it means less. And that's all about, relativity, right? You look back at, the percentage of time. And I think about my kids. I have, a 15, an 11, and an 8-year-old. And I can look about 8-year-old, 1 year for him is, 15% of his life, whereas 1 year for me is, very little of my life. So,
do the math.
I can't do the math in my head, but it's 5% of my life or less. So it's not that significant when it comes to you know how much time it is for me. But like, so if I say wait an hour to me is not very long. An hour to him may be very long because he hasn't lived that long. So it's a big part. And same thing with like trust. If we've worked together for 10 years and you miss one or two emails, then 99.99% of the time you're on. And I can excuse those couple of times. But if we've only worked together for a day and you didn't reply to my emails, now like 90% of my emails haven't been replied to. So that's a problem. And I
Yeah.
see where that trust is built and how it affects things.
Yeah. And this is raising for me in my own mind an interesting sort of parallel set of issues around, well, okay, then how do you build trust and
Mhm.
credibility over time? And after the pandemic, it's just been increasingly difficult for people who are not seeing their managers or not seeing the people that are on their teams regularly. If they're only interacting over Zoom and over email, it makes it much harder to actually build that trust and that credibility. And so that giving people the benefit of the doubt and the grace if you're not actually building a relationship. You just think about how do you build a friendship? How do you build a relationship with anybody? It's very hard to do if it's just virtual, especially for people who are earlier in their careers. And so, I am an advocate for sort of hybrid, different ways of working for sure. And earlier in your career, especially, or if you're new to managing a team, you have to think of how am I going to invest in building
Mhm.
relationship with this team? And it probably means some degree of in-person connection.
Yeah, I think that's super important. Not just I think in-person connection is important, but also that serendipity when you're in an office and you just kind of walk in, and you see somebody and you start a conversation. Like there's a guy that I work with in the office, and we don't actually work together on any projects whatsoever. But he'll have an Eagles shirt on every now and then, and I'm an Eagles fan, so it's like, we'll strike up a conversation about something, and we built that relationship, and now if there is an issue with his department or something, I know there's somebody I trust that I can go to because we built a connection on something as, meaningless as the Eagles, but it's still something that's important to both of us, so we have that connection that would have never happened if we were fully remote.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Because it's again, it's about how do you build the relationship? We are humans that are not just focused on output. We're not like robots. We're not just focused solely on output and production, right? We're really about what humans are emotional beings. And so really good, effective leaders, managers take an interest in how are their people doing, what's going on in their lives. Like you don't need to know every deepest, darkest secret, but like I know whenever I've had a manager who's really taken an interest in, pays attention, asks me hey, last time we talked, you said your dad wasn't feeling well. How's he doing? Just simple checking in, showing that again, what anybody does as a relationship is so important. And it is just a little easier to do that when you're in person.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I want to talk a little bit about your book and, why did you decide to write a book about, and where did you mentioned earlier about how honesty is important. That's where you kind of came up with your name, but how did all that kind of come together as a, book?
Yeah, I mean, I'd been working with and sort of really doing trainings and workshops for lots of different types of leaders around how to communicate more
Mhm.
effectively. So the chapter in the book that's focused on communication at work, there's a framework called the core framework in there, was sort of the idea that sort of was the genesis of this. And as I started to do some research on the other communications books that were out there, I started to realize that there weren't really many that I could find, if any, that were sort of taking a big picture view of how do we communicate just as a person in the world today. So a lot of them were focused on here's how to manage hard conversations with your spouse at home.
Mm.
Here's one around the powerful questions to ask when you're listening. But rarely did they actually put them all together. And what I'm really interested in is sort of thinking, okay, as a human, how we communicate at work is essentially how we communicate online, how we communicate at home. And so I wanted to make sure that we're sort of taking a real full holistic approach. And as I started to get into it, I really realized that so much of the root of effective communication is around really being honest about two questions. One is, who am I speaking to or communicating with? And really knowing your audience, because anything worth communicating is worth communicating because you want somebody to know, feel, or do something. And so, in order to get them to do something or feel a certain way, you have to understand them. You have to understand their level of sophistication or knowledge with what you're talking about. You have to understand their mental emotional state so that you can tailor what you're communicating to meet them where they are. And then the other is a lot of times leaders, especially, will start talking or communicating without being really clear about what are you trying to communicate. And so I really want people to do the work for themselves of what makes this conversation that we're about to have difficult, or
Mhm.
what makes this presentation important for me to give. If I were to walk down the street and run into somebody who was in the audience a week later and say, "Hey, what was my presentation about?" I would want them to remember clearly what the one mixed sentence sort of description was. And so doing the work on the front end of really being honest about what am I trying to convey? What is upsetting to me? What's challenging? What am I excited about? And naming it, being specific, is really important. And there's some exercises in the book that we talk about around how to listen well, but really around how to do some self reflection so that you really kind of show up communicating. Because really, the words that you speak or write are sort of, you know, the last 50% of the communication. The whole
Right.
first half to me is really that sort of that work, that sort of relational working through it yourself. So that's why I called it honestly speaking. Be honest. Be honest with yourself, be honest with the people you're talking to.
Yeah, I think the first part is being honest with yourself of what you want to convey is sometimes the hardest part for me is to kind of, ask myself, what is it that I'm really trying to say here? Because I'll have a feeling, but I'm not as in tune with like putting that feeling into words. So it gets a little bit complicated. And this is going to sound probably terrible, but I found that like bouncing my ideas off of like ChatGPT or something first before having a one-on-one with somebody helps me figure out what I really want to say, and how I want to say them. So like I can go to ChatGPT and like put like 10 ideas, and then I can like, put like 5 or 6 of them together, and then I can like, put like 5 or 6 of them together, and then I can like, put like 5 or 6 of them together, and then I can like, put like 5 or 6 of them together, and then I can like, put like 5 or 6 of them together, and then I can like, put like 5 or 6 of them together, and then I can like, put like 5 or 6 of them together, and then I can like, put like 5 or 6 of them together, and then I can like, put like 5 or 6 of them together, and then I can like, put like 5 or 6 of them together, and then I can like, put like 5 or 6 of them together, and then I can like, put like 5 or 6 of them together, and then I can like, put like 5 or 6 of them together, and then I can like, put like 5 or 6 of them together, and then I can like, put like 5 or 6 of them together, and then I can like, put like 5 or 6 of them together, I'm about to have a one-on-one and kind of describe the scenario that I'm going to be talking about, and then say, this is what I want to say. And then, have that conversation, virtually. And I'm like, oh, I should have said it this way. I should have thought about it this way. This makes more sense. This is more about what I'm trying to get to. And then when I have the conversation in real life, I've almost practiced it a time or two, and I feel more comfortable doing it that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And I have to say, for me, with a couple of cautions, because some of the work that I do with executives now in the coaching space is people are like, well, why work with you instead of just like have a coach as my chat, chat
Mhm.
GPT or Claude or whatever. And a lot of these tools are meant to make you happy. They're meant to please you. They're meant
Right.
to affirm you. And a lot of these conversations are hard for exactly the opposite reason, because we're in disagreement or because somebody isn't trying to make me happy. They're actually trying to challenge me or trying to go against what I'm saying. And so I think that those types of tools are really useful if we can use them as a mirror to help us reflect back. How does what I'm saying, how does it land? How am I experienced? Versus asking it to script it out for you. Because I think we've all been in situations where somebody feels like you're having a conversation or watching a presentation and they're regurgitating a script, but it doesn't feel like they've actually internalized in a human way what they're hearing and seeing. So even when I do like presentations, trainings and stuff, I'll tell people it's better to have a plan than a script. Figure out
Mhm.
what are the points that you want to land, but goes to the same point. What's the main point that I'm trying to land? What are the couple points of context that I want to do? So I think that a lot of these AI tools are really powerful and useful for either helping you mine what you're trying to say and get cleared on it, but also to refine maybe what you want to say. Hey, here's what I'm thinking of saying. Give me two or three different options for how I might say this in a slightly more encouraging way, for example, or a slightly less sort of abrasive way. But the thing is, I think a lot of us, when we start to get really wordy or when we don't have like when we don't know what we're saying, it actually gets really confusing. And a lot of times we have this instinct to like, oh, we got to just say something, we got to be out there. And then you end up, rooting a lot more confusion or misunderstanding than if you'd just taken the extra beat. I want to take one step back, if I could, though,
Mhm.
which is a lot of times this is hard, not for anybody's fault. It's not like you're a bad person or you're not educated or you haven't even had a wealth of experience. Especially in the West, a lot of us are not really raised or trained, as you mentioned earlier, in a way where we're actually given the skills on how to do this. And especially the skills around talking about emotions. Most of us, most adults can't name more than about a handful of basic emotions. And the more you're able to discern what the feelings are that you're having and experiencing in a little bit more of a detailed, nuanced way, the easier it is for you to look at it and then figure out where you want to go. So there are all sorts of books, a few of them sitting, behind me here in my office that actually help explain different ways of doing this. I love there's like a tool that anybody can look up online. It's like called the feelings wheel. And it basically takes like 6 or 8 different big emotions, and then it gives granulated, options. So you get this wheel of I think it's like more than 100 different, emotions that humans experience. And it matters less what the specific one is, and it's just more about giving people a little bit more capacity to understand and discern, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? So anything that we do to help us manage through and practice these types of things is for sure better, whether that's AI, whether it's the feelings wheel, whatever.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've learned to do, because like you said, AI it's like it tries to please you. So it's gonna come back with like the answer that you're looking for. So a lot of times I'll have like I'll open up like a Gemini window on one and a ChatGPT window over here, and then I will ask a question to ChatGPT from one perspective, and then I'll ask the opposite question from a different perspective, and then compare the results and say like, which one's true, or hopefully they both are in alignment, but sometimes that's not very it doesn't happen very often. A lot of times they're trying to please you, so they're telling you what you want to hear, and that can get kind of challenging.
Yeah.
But yeah, for sure. I think it's just having practice and getting reps, just like when you're speaking to an audience, giving that practice of going through it multiple times, going through your presentation. And I think you're absolutely right, going with like points that you want to make versus, a script. Because if you get off script, then it just throws off your whole thing. But if you're just hitting points, you can always come back to something that you missed or something that you want to, hammer home, or hopefully they have questions about something and you can kind of drill into those and have a thoughtful conversation back and forth. Um, one of the things that I liked about your book is that it's not just about work; it's also about life and talking to your spouse or your family and things like that. How do you see like the areas of communication, whether it be with work or home, coming together, and how skills are used in both?
Yeah, I think that there is a fair amount of overlap, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes the incentives are different. So what motivates us to be successful in a communication at work may be a little different than what motivates us to be successful if we're talking to our partner, boyfriend, girlfriend, parents, whatever. But in any case, the consistent parts of this are it's a relationship, right? And all of us bring with us conditioning and history to all of these relationships, even conditioning that may have nothing to do with this particular relationship, right? And so part of the idea of being honest with yourself in any of these moments is also trying to be honest about, okay, what are the facts and what are the situation that I'm in? I want to be able to see this situation as clearly as possible. I think we've all been on the receiving end of like when somebody comes at us and it feels like it's like a tsunami of like, whoa, where is this coming from? Like this is more than just this little disagreement around did I take the garbage out or not, right? Where is all the history that, and so as a communicator, you want to think about how can I try to separate out all of the conditioning, all of the history so that I can really clearly discern and see clearly what am I dealing with in this moment? How can I find the grounding underneath me about what I'm dealing with here? And that's exactly the same, no matter whether you're at work or whether you're online communicating to somebody that you don't know, Reddit or whatever, or if you're communicating, at home. I think sometimes the conversations at home in our personal life or with friends can often be a little more challenging because I think sometimes the power dynamics and the emotionality can all just be a little bit different. But really, the power of being able to be honest with yourself, really be, and also maintain your boundaries, right? And maintain that sort of grounding in really who you are and what you stand for. And, a lot of us sometimes will try to placate somebody to make them happy. We are not very good about maintaining boundaries, especially if you're the type of person that likes to care for other people. I spend a lot of time in my another part of my life in the yoga world, very empathetic, very thoughtful people. Oftentimes, this is very hard for people in those environments. So we want to make sure that we're really grounded in who we are, what we stand for, but also what is this moment that I'm looking at, so that it isn't bringing with me a whole tsunami of things that are really maybe unrelated to the communication that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I have to say boundaries is one of those things that I struggled with early on in my career, and I read a book by I think it was Henry Cloud called Boundaries, and then it was like Boundaries for Leaders, and then it was the Boundaries for Parenting and things. I read a bunch of them, but for me, when I came to the realization that setting up boundaries isn't just good for me, but it's also good for whoever I'm setting up the boundary for to help them out. And it kind of changed my point of view that I wasn't being selfish by setting this boundary up. I was actually helping them in a way. And, I probably took till I had kids before I really realized that like setting boundaries isn't just for me, it's also for them. And it's a benefit to both parties. That's where it really kind of clicked for me that the importance of boundaries and having them in conversations and in everything else you do.
Yeah, yeah. I'm it's just it's hard. It's hard to do, but it's important to do. The one thing that's sometimes difficult is if you have a boundary and you think you've set it, but then you haven't communicated it. And so how does the other person know? And then you start to get frustrated because they're like, well, they're not respecting. Well, it's like, well, you have to communicate it. And so don't get all, agitated and angry and upset or feel like hurt if you haven't communicated it. So it's sort of it's again, it's a relationship. It kind of go both ways for
Yeah,
sure.
and sometimes it's hard to communicate that boundary too without coming off in a way that sounds like you're, you know, mad or being a jerk. You have to do it in a way that's like you set it up front, have good expectations set up front. That's really an important thing that I think leaders need to do is to give their expectations up front versus like waiting until someone violates those expectations and then coming down on them hard because they don't know, and you have to realize that and you have to take responsibility of saying, I didn't set those expectations properly. I need to do a better job of that and taking ownership of that situation.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I think it's a matter of even if, for example, a new leader, if you inherit a new team, for
Mhm.
example, come in new to an organization, one of the early first conversations I might have with people on my team is how how do you like to be communicated with? Like,
Mm.
and it's that invitation, be a part of the conversation. How do you like to sort of experience, challenge, or what do you need? What are the boundaries that you like to set for yourself? What feels important to you? And so you set that early on so that you're not waiting until something's wrong to then try to have that conversation too. It's sometimes really important. And again, it sets the tone of that trust and that credibility over time. So, sometimes people find it hard to name. And so, as a leader, partly my job would be, or I coach leaders, it's like your job to give people the space to come to you with that kind of a thing. Because absent that, they may not. And then you're actually doing you a disservice and you're doing them a disservice. So try to create that space or that opportunity for people to come to you with that. And then it sets that tone. So hopefully you can, continue to check on it, in on
Yeah.
it over time.
So when you say create that space, do you mean like a scheduled time, or is it more like having the atmosphere of you're welcome to come in, or is it a little bit of both?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, I think as a leader myself, have tried to practice this. I coach leaders on it. Having regular opportunities and touch points to check in. A lot of us will have like one-on-ones with people in our
Mhm.
team and tend to focus a lot on business and outcome. And I think it's really important to set aside certain of those meetings that are dedicated just to career aspirations, career goals, to check in. Hey, how do you think things are going? It's not a performance review time. It's sort of like, how are things going with us? Like, how can I help support you? What can you do to support me? Really good performance evaluation systems will encourage that conversation to happen if they're not. But, you really want to make sure that you're doing that. Go have coffee with everybody on your team on a quarterly basis. I used to do this in my last job at Johnson and Johnson. I would go, even if they were people who directly reported to me. It's actually especially important if they don't. Meet with them regularly. What's on your mind? How are things going? How can I help you? What are you interested in? What are your career goals? Where do you want to be? So that it's sort of just like you're again creating that space
Mhm.
and asking the question and then listening, being okay with the silence. It's amazing what kind of data you will gather. It's really telling as a leader.
Yeah, and I think, being okay with the silence is, one of the skills that I think you have to learn over time. I used to always wanna, like, fill the silence with something, and I've learned now that if I just wait, then they will fill the silence, and that's more valuable than what I could be putting in there, you know?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I've gotten so much better. I used to not be good at this at all, and I'm still probably, to be really honest, working on it. I will say though that it's also powerful because if you think when you're in a conversation, even if it's not contentious or a disagreement, but it's like you're going to talk to somebody who's more senior than you, it could be intimidating. And there's all of these emotions going on. And so somebody asks you, what do you want to do with your career? You're like, I don't know. I don't have an answer at the top of my head. That silence sometimes just gives people the space to really process and think for a moment, and let it sink in. And I think the adrenaline that we tend to experience, so the endorphins of like being in one of these conversations kind of overrides that. So again, as a leader, it's like you want to create again that silence, that space for people to be able to sort of think through. Or you can say, hey, this is what I'd like to talk about in our coffee conversation next week, and
Mhm.
whatever else you would like to come prepared to talk about. So it gives people a little bit more of a time to think about it in a non-rushed, non-emotional way. But, all of these little tricks are about exactly as you say, silence and not filling the space and that instinct that a lot of us have.
Yeah, yeah, and I know, like, when I first became kind of leading a team, I always wanted to start the meeting with my ideas and kind of throw them out there and let people, like, tear them apart. But what I found is if I put the idea out there, people just tried to support that idea. But if I waited and let other people put ideas out there, then, we became is almost like a more honest conversation because they were no longer just trying to not hurt my feelings and telling me my idea was bad. And they felt, awkward putting out their own ideas. But if I let them go first and I wait, then I learned that they're more open to the conversation. They're less defensive. It's just a better, I don't know, it's a better overall meeting.
Yeah. And I think it actually this now I'm thinking about hearing what you're saying, it makes me think back to our earlier part of our conversation where we are talking about vulnerability and not knowing all the answers, right? So,
Mhm.
and if you do have an opinion or an idea or a point of view, creating the space for people to come forward to you with them is really about, well, hey, actually, they might come up with something better than I did or different than I did. But even if they don't, I still have now created an environment where people feel like they can be a part of that conversation and they see me as being more vulnerable as opposed to, again, I'm showing up in the meeting. I'm the person in charge. I should have all the answers. I should have the ideas and I should have it all figured out. That doesn't create any space for anybody to participate.
Right.
Even if you then say, "Hey, what am I missing?" Well, that's nice, but also how could you invite people to presume not just tell you, "Oh, that idea was great, Andrew," but, "Hey, tell me, what have I gotten wrong? Where am I missing? Where might you go in a different direction?" Like, proactively ask. To presume that you have it figured out 100% of it, I think is helpful.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a good way of putting it. Um, Andrew, this has been a great conversation, and I've got your book on Audible. I'm excited to have it. Tell the audience a little bit about how they can find out more about what you're doing and where they can pick up a copy of the book and learn more.
Yeah, so the book should be available on Amazon and on Audible. It's called Honestly Speaking: How the Way We Communicate Transforms Leadership, Love, and Life. There's also a link to all of it on my website, which is azureleadership.com. You can also find me, first name, last name, Andrew Blotky, on LinkedIn, and all of it will be there. And always love to hear from folks. So thank you for the conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I thought it was great. Thanks so much for coming on. And I'm going to link that in the show notes too at geekleader.com so people can go there and click through and connect with Andrew. Thanks so much. Hope you enjoyed the show. Please go to geekleader.com to learn more about what this guest is up to, click on their links, and connect with them online. I would also greatly appreciate it if you could leave me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. And make sure you've subscribed if you haven't already. And if you feel so inclined, you can leave me a tip by going to geekleader.com/tip.